Hello, this is Conway Lynch, and I'm presenting my final project for reading, writing, and critical thinking in a standards aligned system, and it's called Thinking Outside the Books. So, given the course's name, it might be funny that my presentation's called Thinking Outside the Books. I mean, it's reading and writing, so you would think inside the book, right? Well, it's not wrong to think that, but in this presentation, I argue that we need to be teaching our students that reading and writing and literacy in general is not always and only directly linked to books or any other written media. In fact, literacy spans a myriad of things in a student's life and in any individual's life. And I'm going to start the presentation by demonstrating my literacy foundation and the journey that I've gone on in order to enhance, evolve, and ultimately expand my understanding of literacy. So in this slide here, I'm introducing my literacy foundation, and it might look like a random amalgamation of things from Junie B. Jones to Pokemon and popsicle sticks, but all of those things are actually essential to my literacy and my development of critical thinking, my reading skills, and my writing skills. In the beginning of the course, Dr. Pabon asked us to write a literacy narrative. And at first, I was like, well, what does that mean? I know how to read, I know how to write, I'm literate. Um, Geez, where do I start? But then I thought deeper about the question, what makes me literate? What are my literacies? And that's more than just reading and writing, right? So I thought about those foundations, right? My mom used to read me Junie B. Jones, and I remember it being some of the best times as a kid because my mom would put on voices for all the characters and stuff like that, and it was always a lot of fun. But beyond that, something else that I thought about and realized really shaped and formed my understanding of language was Pokemon and playing video games in general. Pokemon in particular, though, because in the game, there's all these creatures, the Pokemon, the pocket monsters, who have these weird names like Bulbasaur and Charmander. But if you think about the name Bulbasaur, it's actually showing the gamer or the reader here the root words and descriptive characteristics that make up those names. So when we think about it linguistically, suddenly Bulbasaur's name isn't just a random assignment, but instead it's a clever combination of words used to describe the Pokemon. The back of the creature has this garlic like bulb, hence bulb, and it's kind of like a dinosaur, hence soar. This word association and creativity gave me a look at the power of language and how it can be used in inventive ways to convey information. Another formative memory I have from my early foundations in literacy is the lessons I got from my mom. You see, my brother was diagnosed with dyslexia at a young age, and with that came a lot of home tutoring from my mom. She made these popsicle sticks that had root words on them, and my brother was challenged to create new words by using suffixes and prefixes that were written on the popsicle sticks. Being a tag along, I was usually there for the lessons, so I soaked up a lot of that information like a sponge. That really gave me a strong foundation for understanding literacy. My mom wasn't the only woman who was formative in my literacy journey. My fifth grade teacher gave me some advice that's been absolutely foundational to my entire ethos, and that's to write the way that you speak. And it's that lesson that I hope to bring into my classroom in the future, but I'll discuss that more later on. When I think about the things that were missing from my foundational years in literacy, the biggest thing that comes to mind is the lack of any multicultural influences on my literacy. I didn't really get any history lessons on where I come from, where my family comes from, let alone anything about different cultures and different communities that are near me or far away. So let's move on to the next slide here, leaps in literacy. And you can see I have the KU logo, and that's because I think that the greatest leap I took in my journey was my time in college. As a professional writing major, I learned all kinds of things about critical thinking and deeply analyzing text and writing in a clear, efficient way so that I can communicate messages without any fluff or without any confusion. Learning to write effectively made me a better reader, a better communicator, and holistically transformed me into a much more critical thinker. Fast forward a couple of years in the professional sector as a reporter, as a marketer, and as a community manager, and now in my master's, I'm developing an evolved understanding of literacy. There are some particular expansions and revelations that I've come to and acquired in this course, and those pertain to the teachings of Gloria Ladson Billings, including but not limited to her frameworks for culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogies. I also got to read the book The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which, while at first glance doesn't seem like a story of literacy, but really it is, because we're talking about a woman whose cells, her cancer cells, wound up being essential to countless medical advances and scientific advances. Her unique immortal cells allowed scientists to experiment in ways that were never possible before. But what makes it a story of literacy is the fact that those cells were stolen from her. There was no informed consent for the collection of those cells because Henrietta couldn't be informed. She didn't have the skill set required in order to understand what was happening to her and what those doctors were doing to her. And ultimately, her family then was stolen from because her story's been stolen, and those cells are still being manufactured today and still being used in research today with no credit going to the family or Henrietta herself. I also learned about how there's different expressions of literacy, like in The Skin We Ink by Kirkland. Derek's tattoos are an expression of his grief, his memory, and his love. The boss tattoo I have a picture of there with the pit bull is an homage to Derek's brother, and it's a tattoo that documents the tragedy and it disrupts him from forgetting his brother's murder. It's a eulogy that's connected to him on a level that's physical. Below the tattoo, you can see I have a picture of the Learning for Justice logo. Learning for Justice is a collaborative group of teachers working in partnership with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. The lessons teachers share on their website give educators an opportunity to learn how they can integrate culture and be culturally relevant, historically relevant, and culturally sustaining in all their lessons. You can see I have a picture of a scrapbook there as well. And the reason I included that is because I've come to think of literacy as a scrapbook of who you are as a person, what you've learned, what you've experienced. All of that is your literacies in life, and your literacies in life make up who you are. They are your essence. To the right of the scrapbook, you can see some terms that come from AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. In Django Paris's article, They're in My Culture, They Speak the Same Way, African American Language in Multi-Ethnic High Schools, Paris demonstrates how AAVE has become a dominant dialect in urban environments, particularly urban schools. Interestingly, it's not just Black youth who are using AAVE, it's actually students of mixed backgrounds and ethnicities and cultures. Something that really stood out to me in the article was his discussion of capping. Now, I'll be honest, I've been saying that's cap for a while, but did I realize it was AAVE? No, not really. And that's because it's been popularized online, or rather, instead of popularized, it's been appropriated. Because I was interested, I did a little bit more research into this, and it's kind of a shame to see that, much like Henrietta's cells, AAVE is being stolen away from Black people, and it's just being chalked up to, oh, it's internet culture, i.e. white culture. It's reminiscent of how before Henrietta's name was out there, people referred to the cells as coming from Helen Lane, a clearly whitewashed name. Some more revelations in my literacy journey came from the incredible book Cultivating Genius by Gholdy Muhammad. In the book, Muhammad introduces the framework for historically responsive literacy. The framework is similar to culturally responsive literacy and culturally responsive pedagogies, but it differs in that it asks educators to teach learners about their history, about the foundations for their literacy, the literacy that's in their DNA, and explore that and evolve on that and build on that. One of the early examples of teachings that we can learn from that Muhammad presented was the literacy societies, including reading rooms and library companies and debating societies. They were much more than book clubs or associations that it just engaged in literature. Rather, they had stronger aims of advancing the conditions of African Americans and others in the wider society. These societies had a collectivist idea of education, where today in society, unfortunately, education and professionalism are based in individualism and competition. But these societies wanted to share knowledge gained from acts of literacy rather than keep that education to themselves. The collaboration for literacy built the foundation for the chain letter instruction model, which embodied a shared accountability for knowledge. Educators can apply this framework to teach their students more than just those standards of decoding, fluency, vocabulary, etc., and really help students express themselves in a way that allows them to share their voices and visions. They can select texts that speak to their multiple identities instead of just selecting text based on those standards alone. And they can help other students by sharing with them and talking with them and engaging with them in a collaborative way. On my next slide here, I have a quote from Muhammad that says, "The emancipatory and humanizing aspects of literacy provide access to mental freedom, political power, and agenda building." And I say at the bottom there, providing power while preserving particularity. What I mean by that is that we can teach students the codes of power without stripping them of their culture, of what makes them, of their individualism, of their creativity, of everything that makes them, their scrapbook of literacy. In order to preserve our students' being, we need to be culturally relevant and we need to be historically relevant. We need to preserve their traditions. We need to highlight their strengths. We need to show them their power. We need to make accommodations when we have to. We have to be respectful, understanding, and we have to cultivate the genius that already exists within them. So how do educators do that? How do we remain culturally relevant, historically relevant, and culturally responsive in a system that's designed to align with standards rather than to align with the cultures of our students? Well, it's not as hard as it sounds, and hopefully in the next few slides on my future classroom, I'll demonstrate for you some examples and some easy ways to integrate these frameworks into your classroom. So to start doing the work that you need to do in order to have an effective classroom, you need to share about yourself and have your students share with you and share with each other. Everybody needs to get to know each other. In Cultivating Genius, Muhammad introduces the idea of a name story. Now, it seems obvious to introduce each other by our names, but names are not just names. It's through our names that we're first introduced to the world, and our names carry a lot of history. They carry a lot of culture with them. Muhammad says when she asks students to discuss or write their name stories, she asks who named them, what their name means, and what they know about their family's cultural naming practices. Then she asks them to describe one of their own name stories. This leads to students asking critical questions about society and about what their names mean. What do their names reveal about their identities? What do they hide? What's the relationship between our names and our cultural identities? To what extent do we choose the names and labels others use for us? You can see that even in a task as simple as sharing names, there's so much cultural significance that can be pulled into the lesson and pulled into the classroom. It's often that culturally diverse kids don't have names that fit into the mainstream culture. We're not talking about Kevins, Tylers, Hannahs, and Alices here. Despite my whiteness, I can actually relate to this. I mean, my name is Conway, and believe me, it gets mixed up all the time with Conrad, Conlin, Connor. I've heard it all, and I've heard all of the relations to, oh, like Conway Twitty. Nope, it's a family name, actually. Giving students the opportunity to tell their name stories lets them express themselves and express their culture and tell their family story. And it also makes it so that that sort of erasure and sort of hiccups over, oh, how do I pronounce this name, doesn't happen. It doesn't have a place in my classroom. Educators should also take the time to introduce themselves as more than just that. Their students need to know who they are as a person so that they can identify with them, so that they can trust them. To me, this is a great place to demonstrate a literacy journey to the students. I can show kids that just like them, I had humble beginnings, you know? I didn't always want to be a teacher. I didn't always think I would love writing, but anyone can do it. On my next slide here, incorporating comprehension, you can see that the students in the picture are talking. They're discussing things together, they're sharing knowledge, and they're learning by doing. Something I hope to implement in my classroom would be a classroom Twitter. Now, I know that sounds weird, but I would challenge students to make a profile that really gives the class a sense of who they are. Somewhere where they can speak in their voice without being or feeling censored or like they have to adhere to certain standards of communication. Somewhere where they can openly speak and somewhere where I can openly speak with them. It would be a way for parents to also get involved and see what's going on in the class, because it would be a class conversation hosted online in a thread where you can see everyone and how they're engaging with the class. The concept is culturally responsive and sustaining for the students and their family because it allows for engagement with me outside of regular hours, and it allows for engagement with me where one could speak in their native language and at the click of a button it can be translated. That way everyone's on the same page. Speaking of speaking in your native language, one of the introductory assignments that I would love to give to my students would be a Write the Way You Speak assignment, where students would be challenged to write an essay, a short biography telling me their literacy story, right? But instead of just writing one essay, I would challenge my students to write two. One, written in the style that they've been told is appropriate for writing a paper, and another, written alongside it using their vernacular, dialect, native language, or just written in a way that it feels like they're writing in a journal, the way that they're thinking, the way that they're speaking. This sort of thing would strengthen my students' confidence in themselves and in the way that they speak and the way that they write. I don't want anyone to feel silenced. I want to hear everyone's voice, and I want to hear their natural voice. The next slide here is on national and state standards, and it shows how I'll approach those standards set in my classroom. So the standards set, according to the PA Department of Education website, students graduating from Pennsylvania schools in the 21st century need to be future ready at the end of grade 12. Students must be able to read more challenging and complex text. Moreover, they will need experiences that enable them to use literacy as a tool for learning the content in each of the academic disciplines. Basically, what this is saying is that kids need to be able to understand new digital rhetoric. They need to be able to read and digest and understand complex text that goes beyond the regular curriculum, in my opinion. And those experiences that enable them to use literacy as a tool for learning across content areas, to me, that's the holistic education of literacy. That means integrating literacy into every avenue of education. So how am I going to meet those standards? Well, I'm going to build rigor into my lessons. Complexity is a challenge sometimes, but challenge is the key to learning, and you shouldn't be afraid to challenge your students regardless of their background. The best way to get students involved with challenging content is by giving them relevant content, content that makes sense to them, content that speaks to who they are. My lessons are going to be shaped by the past, by those early literacy societies, by the traditions across multiple cultures, and by engaging with authors and artists from many different backgrounds. This historically responsive teaching style shapes the students by their history and prepares them for the future. It's a dynamic mindset that requires educators think about the teachings of the past and how they can be implemented in the future. My next slide here, authors and their texts. This is the most essential thing in my classroom. We can't only expose kids, especially BIPOC learners, to white authors and white artists. It doesn't make any sense. We need to expose them to people that represent who they are. This is culturally sustaining text, right? You can see I show Kendrick Lamar. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner. Folks, come on. The guy's a lyrical genius. If that's not poetry, I don't know what is. We're talking about Langston Hughes, too. You know, the Harlem Renaissance. The man spoke to the Black experience of the time and how that still impacts and is present today. I'm going to expose my students to Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize winner for literature. Importantly, I also plan on incorporating authors and artists of South American descent like Sandra Cisneros, whose book The House on Mango Tree tells the story of a young Latina girl growing up in Chicago and dealing with oppression and adversity. It's not just authors and songwriters either. Guillermo del Toro provides an excellent example of an Oscar-winning director and screenwriter who's of Mexican descent. Including artists that are representative of my student body will help engage the students so that they can see themselves in the content. And it's important to note that just like how literacy doesn't just mean reading and writing, text doesn't just mean text. I was taught that text means all art, all forms of literacy. My next slide here demonstrates just how important it is that students see themselves in what they're learning. Muhammad said, before getting to literacy skill development, such as decoding, fluency, comprehension, writing, and other content learning standards, students must authentically see themselves in the learning. The citation below says, a great deal of research has found that students have the potential for success when they see themselves in the curriculum and when their cultural, gender, and racial identities are affirmed. That's the goal of my classroom, to affirm my students' identities. I'll end with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that says, now each of you is in the process of building the structure of your lives, and the question is whether you have a proper, a solid, and a sound blueprint. Only your students can be the architects for their future, for their lives, for their literacy journey. But as an educator, you can be the foreman. With the historically responsive, and culturally sustaining frameworks, we can give kids the tools they need to be effective readers, writers, and critical thinkers so they can go beyond the standards set by this system. Thanks for listening.